Okay, so, oh, wait a minute. So, I have to a little bit get situated. Okay, so I have a bit of a, wait, I have to get out of that one too.
I know, it's really annoying.
So I have a bit of a script, and I can't really perform, like I can't really look at you and be with the script and get what I have to get across. So I'm sorry that I'm just going to be kind of like in this reading mode, but okay, is that all I have to do? Okay. Max Mueller was a German-born Indologist who was hired to translate Vedic texts by the East India Company, a corporate trading entity and the precursor of British rule in India. In 1868, in a letter to the then British Secretary of India, Max Mueller wrote, quote, "India has been conquered once, but India must be conquered again, and that second conquest should be a conquest by education," unquote. In another letter to his wife, he reveals what kind of education that will be, quote, "If the Rig Veda is the root of their religion, and to show them what the root is, I feel sure, is the only way of uprooting all that has sprung from it," unquote. When Mueller was commissioned to translate the Rig Veda, he changed the date of its composition as to not conflict with or negate biblical time. This artificial construction remains a historical fact, as any Wikipedia search on the Rig Veda will reveal. He's also the author of the Aryan invasion theory, which, although widely debunked as a, quote, "means of British policy to justify their own intrusion into India and their subsequent colonial rule," unquote, has to this day also been largely accepted. In all of his fascination for the subcontinent, Max Mueller never traveled to India. From a third-person perspective, with questionable command of the Sanskrit language, he didn't just interpret, he rewrote Indian history. Eurocentric Indologists have long framed India from the outside, redating Indian texts as to not conflict with Christian time, superimposing an Aryan invasion myth, suggesting that the Vedas are not indigenous to India, that India is not indigenous to itself, wedging a Dravidian-Aryan conflict in a classic divide-and-conquer rule, and otherwise mutilating the esteem of the culture it had come to colonize. It should also be noted that Max Mueller was one of the early influential founders of the academic discipline of religious studies.
Wow.
The title for this presentation manifested in a Facebook thread. I had initially intended to make it into a little zine, but little it is not. I also wanted to read it as a play, but was given neither the time nor the permission from the cast, which stars myself, Sean Fite, Matthew Remski, B. Scottfield of Decolonizing Yoga, and introduces Pankaj Seth of Deep Yoga. The thread is currently a public post on Sean Fite's Facebook page and is dated January 7th. I highly suggest you go there and read the thread in its entirety. It's been equated to a bar brawl, and for me, highlights the colonial dynamic as it now pertains to yoga and its attendant philosophies. This was not the first time that I had asked Matthew or Sean prior to their teaching a workshop on the Bhagavad Gita if they had ever studied the Gita with a qualified teacher. But the ensuing dialogue was so emblematic of the Orientalist struggle for meaning production that at one point I responded to B. Scottfield of Decolonizing Yoga by saying, "The British Raj would have had in you a great ally as they went about desecrating the texts they translated." Matthew Remski is a self-described writer and teacher of Ayurveda, yoga therapy, and yoga philosophy. He also states that he teaches asana. I say self-described because if you go to his website, he does not mention a single place of study or reference a single teacher. The only mention is of Socrates, and that his approach is Socratic, a Canadian teacher who teaches 4 subject matters that are implicitly derived from Hinduism, one which has specific roots in the Atharva Veda, makes no mention of the cultural origin of his subject matter, and instead grounds him in a Greek philosopher. This is what Rajiv Malhotra describes as digestion. Something from one culture is absorbed into another culture, rendering the origin of identity invisible. What's important to note in Matthew's case is that the digestion is seemingly only partial. Matthew retains the original names of the subject matter because that is his bread and butter in a billion-dollar industry. Malhotra's U-turn theory provides us with a well-structured description on what I refer to as the looting of yoga. Malhotra outlines in 5 points how the West appropriates Indian culture, or how non-Indians relate to Indian thought. And it's important to note here that Malhotra also is very careful to distinguish that not all appropriators or non-Indians go through all of these stages, but these are all of the stages. Stage 1. There is an initial quest that can be quite devotional and serious on the part of the non-Indian. One may get initiated, immerse themselves in Indic thought, and generally enjoy the benefit of learning. In stage 2, there is a distancing and neutralization, a distancing from Indianness and a subsequent neutralization of the origin, which renders the things somewhat generic. In stage 3, the West lays claim to the origin. The previously Indian thing is no longer generic, but part of their own culture as some secular scientific idea that is now part of Western discovery. Stage 4, for me, represented a kind of negative transference and expresses active animosity. This is about individuation. You can only claim it as your own if you destroy the origin. And stage 5 describes the reimportation of the ideas to complete the colonial cycle. The Indian idea about itself is based largely on what others know about India. This is what I call forced assimilation. You are forced to assimilate to the idea that the dominant paradigm constructs about you, and what is so damaging in this case is your own cultural identity, rewritten history, and mistranslated literature is used to help you comply. On January 1st of this year, Matthew Remski introduced a blog post titled Seeking the Gita. He introduces this blog post with a quote by Douglas Brooks. No modern reader should feel the slightest reluctance to interpret the text as she or he sees fit. This is exactly what has always been done without the least amount of compunction. Sean reposted an excerpt from Seeking the Gita in which Matthew writes, quote, one of the key things at stake politically, socio-politically at Kurukshetra is whether or not the human being will continue to be governed by the notion of divinized power, and if not, how divinized power will be transmuted to the state. The God is written to say, you don't have an individual self, you are inside of me. I've already ground you up with my teeth. You have no choice but to act, and to act as I say, unquote. Matthew provides no context for the above interpretation. Citing specific verses is not being philosophically pretentious. It's the most democratic inquiry one can invite because it allows you to go to the source, to wrestle with the meaning production from its own locus. In chapter 11, Krishna shows Arjuna his Vishwarupa, his cosmic form. I've already ground you up with my teeth is from verse 27. In verse 32, Krishna says, Kalaha asmi, I am time, who is the destroyer of people. When Matthew writes, I have already ground you up with my teeth, is it to suggest Krishna as a primitive authoritarian god, someone akin to the god of Matthew's Catholic upbringing? Or is he suggesting that Krishna is saying to Arjuna, having been born, you are already in the jaws of time. The creation is on, your karma is on, and you cannot stop this because you have no choice with time. All forms are bound by time, and time has already decided that your body will be crushed. Everyone on this field is destined for destruction. This teetering on the brink of non-being is the existential crux of the Gita. I initially responded to Sean Fate's repost of Remke's article by saying, I wish those that fancy themselves as studying or speculating on the Gita actually had some sense of the ontological relevance of the text, and that includes tagging Matthew Remski. Sean, I wonder if you could reconcile your understanding, yes, all people will die, yes, it's unjust, yes, death is unavoidable, with that of the Gita. There was never a time I did not exist, neither you nor these kings, nor will any of us cease to exist in the future. Oh, it's chapter 2, verse 12. Matthew replied, Shri, I'm aware that the text teaches an eternal essential self beyond the body. I'm interested in how that teaching impacts bodies. To which I countered, okay, but then why do you use the Gita to explore your own Western psychology? Because the teaching won't impact bodies unless it's properly understood. So far, I don't get the sense that either you or Sean actually understand what the ontological purport of the Gita is, and I'm continually surprised by how much of the Gita you use and lean on to propel your own standpoint, and I guess I'm interested in the impact that philosophical appropriation has on bodies. He goes on to say that any suggestion of a definitive understanding of the text would be appropriation. So I pose the question, would you say there is a definitive understanding of self? He asks, in the text, in myself? I say both, to which he admits, do I have a definitive understanding of self as it applies to me? Not at all. Sean Feit then entered the conversation and responded to my question by adding, my own encounter with the teaching is filtered through Buddhist inquiry around the nature of self, particularly the teaching of anatta, how the self, Atman, can't be found in any specific experience. So I come to the text's seeming assertion of an eternal, transmigrating soul through both humanist skepticism and Buddhist inquiry. He continues, the Gita has become a transnational source text for the yoga diaspora, along with Patanjali Yoga Sutra, and lives in a very different social imaginary than it ever did in India. But if we acknowledge that the Gita as a source text, then we have to reconcile the relationship of the Gita to its own source. The Gita is considered a smriti, what is remembered from what is heard. What is heard is called the Shruti. Another name for the Shruti is the Veda. What happens to an indigenous source text when it is deconstructed through Judeo-Christian or otherwise non-Vedic filters? Matthew suggests readers can begin to disidentify with Arjuna and thereby de-reify Krishna, unquote. It's quite possible that Matthew changed deify to reify because in his initial post, Sean says to Matthew, I love the encouragement to disidentify with Arjuna and therefore undeify Krishna. This eager commitment to secularize and deconstruct the Gita reminds me of a quote by Michael Anthony Hart, which is really an addendum to Eva Marie Godot's concept of radical indigenism, which argues for the reassertion and rebidding of traditional knowledge from its roots, its fundamental principles. Radical indigenous scholars resist the pressure to participate in academic discourse that strips indigenous intellectual tradition of their spiritual and sacred elements. It takes the stand that if the spiritual and sacred elements are surrendered, there is little left of our philosophies that will make any sense. B. Scottfield of Decolonizing Yoga chimed in to say, here are terms associated with some religions. I don't believe in any of them. Bhagavad Gita, Brahman, Atman, Dharma, Karma, Moksha. She then went on to say, the same flawed, complex humanity that wrote the Vedas also wrote Scientology. Wait, did she just equate the rishis to L. Ron Hubbard? She continues her L. Ron Hubbard theory. There is no such thing as self-realization or spiritual awakening or enlightenment. These are magical religious beliefs on par with the teachings of Scientology. The Bhagavad Gita is not a term. It is esteemed as a moksha shastra, a liberation scripture of fifth Veda. The Vedas looked upon as being aparushaya, not created by the human mind. To say that the same complex humanity that wrote the Vedas also wrote Scientology is to, one, not understand how the Veda self-authenticates itself, and two, reveals a Western bias against the validity of indigenous epistemologies. The Vedas and specifically the Upanishads were never intended to be published by Penguin Classics and read on your own as a book. The book is a colonial construct. The East India Company employed European scholars to translate Indian scriptures in order to refute the knowledge of the Vedas and uproot the culture from within. It sought to detach the knowledge from the communities that sustained it in an act of philosophical genocide. You cannot disembody a language from the culture it comes from and hope to understand either the direct meaning or the implied meaning of the words used. The question must therefore necessarily be posed. How can you possibly understand the Gita without a qualified teacher who knows how to wield the epistemology? Matthew will decry the necessity of knowing the things he professes to teach from their own standpoint by saying their own standpoint is so deeply tarnished by caste, it is better to leave him in antiquity. It's a political deflection in the way he maintains his Orientalist gaze. He misquotes Ambedkar in his own article, where he is called out in the comments section, quote, "You substituted Hindu with Hindutva. Either that was willful on your part, or you don't know the difference," unquote. Matthew feels he's on the cutting edge to introduce Western readers to Marxist critique of the Gita, but I cannot go to Marxism for an ontological understanding of myself, because what is describing the nature of capitalism is not a means of knowledge for knowing the self. The first ontological definition given in the Gita is chapter 2, verse 16. For the unreal there is never any being. For the real there is never non-being. The vocabulary used is asat, unreal, and sat, real. Sat and asat, real and unreal, are words that reveal the reality of a given thing. Here is a clay pot. Is the pot real or unreal? I can't say it's unreal because it has an empirical presence. But if I say it is real, what is the reality status left over that I have to describe the clay? The pot is a name that describes an incidental form. It should really be pot clay instead of clay pot, as pot is an adjective to the clay being the substantive. From the standpoint of clay, there is no pot. When Krishna says, you do not have an individual self, Matthew thinks Krishna is power-tripping Arjuna, because Matthew has no concept of the ontology of the Gita. Is the clay power-tripping the pot? There are not two things here to establish a power dynamic. The pot is not sitting upon the clay as an individual, independent self. In this example, the reality status of the clay is real, and the pot is unreal. The non-being attributed to the unreal in this verse does not mean non-existence. It means the pot is completely dependent upon the clay for its existence. It has no independent being. If you translate asat as false, illusion, or non-existence, you have not accounted for the relationship between the clay and the pot. Form is a dependent reality. Form depends completely upon its content for its being. No form can gain an independent reality status. You can't even imagine a form without a content. Try to imagine a shirt without a material. No material, not even paper clips, okay? Just try to imagine a shirt, no form. Not even your imagination can oblige you. What is your clay? You have a form, you are a body, you have a mind. What is your clay? What is that which is all pervasive to your experience of yourself, your sense of being, that sat, that existence, the thing that makes you you? When you say, I am, that amness, what is it? Unfortunately, the answer was lost in translation because Western neo-yoga workshop leaders find it more valuable to deconstruct Hindu texts than to give them their intended meaning. Thank you.